Alexander Pierce stood in the bustling terminal of JFK International Airport, his tailored Armani suit setting him apart from the crowd of weary travelers. At 38, he had built an empire worth billions in the tech industry, but money had never filled the void of genuine connection in his life. The rhythmic tapping of his Italian leather shoes against the polished floor echoed his impatience as he waited for his luggage to appear on the carousel. His mind was already racing through the agenda for tomorrow's board meeting where he would unveil his company's latest innovation, a revolutionary AI system that promised to transform the healthcare industry. The flight from Tokyo had been exhausting, 17 hours of turbulence and cramped first-class accommodations that weren't quite first-class enough for his taste. He glanced at his Patek Philippe watch, a rare edition that cost more than what most people earned in 5 years. Time was the one commodity Alexander couldn't buy more of, and he hated wasting it waiting for luggage. His assistant had offered to handle this mundane task, but after the recent corporate espionage attempt, Alexander had grown paranoid about entrusting important documents to anyone, even his most loyal employees. The prototype plans in his suitcase were worth billions, and he wasn't taking any chances. As the conveyor belt lurched into motion, Alexander felt the familiar buzz of his phone. The screen illuminated with notifications: 37 emails, 12 missed calls, and a text from his mother reminding him about dinner on Sunday, an obligation he had managed to avoid for the past 3 months. His empire demanded constant attention, leaving little room for family obligations or personal relationships. His last relationship had ended precisely because of this imbalance. Victoria had called him emotionally unavailable, a term that seemed ridiculous to a man who prided himself on logical thinking over emotional indulgence. The luggage began appearing on the carousel, and Alexander's eyes scanned for his distinctive titanium-enforced Rimowa case with the subtle red tag, a gift from a Japanese business partner. The crowd pressed forward, eager bodies jostling for position, a human behavior that Alexander found both fascinating and repulsive. How quickly civilization gave way to primal instinct when resources became limited, in this case, the space around the luggage carousel. He maintained his distance, preferring to wait rather than participate in the undignified scramble. Minutes passed, and the crowd thinned as passengers claimed their belongings and dispersed. Alexander spotted a titanium Rimowa suitcase approaching, the exact model as his own, complete with a red tag that matched his perfectly. With a satisfied nod, he stepped forward, extended the handle, and wheeled it away from the carousel. The weight felt right, the dimensions identical to his memory. If there was one thing Alexander prided himself on besides his business acumen, it was his attention to detail, a quality that had served him well in building his tech empire. He navigated through the terminal with practiced efficiency, bypassing the taxi line in favor of the private car service area where his driver would be waiting. The sleek black Tesla was precisely where it should be, and the driver, Marcus, jumped out to take the suitcase from Alexander's hand. "Welcome back, Mr. Pierce. How was Tokyo?" Marcus asked, his voice professional yet warm, the perfect balance that Alexander demanded from his employees. "Productive," Alexander replied, sliding into the leather backseat that seemed to envelop him like an old friend. As the car pulled away from the curb, he felt the familiar tension in his shoulders begin to ease. The chaos of the airport receded behind him, replaced by the cocoon of luxury that his wealth afforded him. The city lights of New York blurred past the window as Marcus navigated through the late evening traffic. Alexander's penthouse in Manhattan awaited him 65 stories above the city, a modernist palace of glass and steel that offered both spectacular views and perfect isolation from the world below. The drive from JFK to Manhattan allowed Alexander to catch up on the most pressing emails that had accumulated during his flight. His fingers danced across the screen of his tablet with practiced precision, each response calculated and measured. There were proposals to review, decisions to make, competitors to analyze the endless dance of corporate chess that had dominated his life for the past 15 years. By the time the Tesla pulled into the private garage beneath his building, Alexander had cleared nearly half of his inbox, a small victory in the never-ending battle against time. The doorman greeted him with a respectful nod as he entered the private elevator that would take him directly to his penthouse. Alexander placed his thumb on the biometric scanner, and the elevator began its smooth ascent. The familiar sensation of rising above the chaos of the city below always brought him a sense of satisfaction, a physical manifestation of his meteoric rise in the business world. The elevator doors opened silently to reveal his domain's 7,000 square feet of architectural brilliance designed by a renowned Japanese minimalist. The space was immaculate, with clean lines and open spaces punctuated by strategically placed art pieces collected from around the world. A Basquiat hung opposite a traditional Zen garden, an embodiment of the contradictions that defined Alexander's personality: chaos and order, risk and calculation, ambition and reflection. He wheeled the suitcase directly to his home office, a glass-encased room with views that stretched across the city skyline. The first order of business was to secure the prototype plans before allowing himself the luxury of rest. Alexander placed the suitcase on his desk and entered the combination 1986, the year of his father's death and the beginning of his own journey toward self-reliance. His fingers moved with muscle memory, but when he attempted to open the case, it remained firmly shut. Frowning, Alexander tried again, carefully aligning each number. Again, the lock held fast. A flicker of irritation crossed his face as he examined the suitcase more carefully. It was then that he noticed a small scratch near the handle that he couldn't recall being there before. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow: this wasn't his suitcase. Despite the identical model and similar red tag, he had taken someone else's luggage. Alexander Pierce, the man who prided himself on never making errors, had made a rookie mistake. He stood frozen for a moment, calculating the implications. The prototype plans were now potentially in the hands of a stranger, plans that could revolutionize medical technology or, in the wrong hands, be weaponized for unimaginable harm. The market value alone was staggering, but the potential humanitarian impact was incalculable. Billions of dollars and countless lives hung in the balance. He needed to act quickly. His first instinct was to call his head of security, but something stopped him. The fewer people who knew about this mistake, the better. For now, he needed to assess the situation calmly and methodically. Perhaps there was a simple explanation: another traveler with identical taste in luggage, who would be just as eager to rectify the mistake. Alexander examined the suitcase more carefully, looking for any identifying markers. His eyes caught a small, handwritten tag partially hidden behind the manufacturer's label, property of E. Blackwood. The name meant nothing to him, but it was a start. If this E. Blackwood had his suitcase, then logic dictated they had arrived on the same flight from Tokyo. Passengers were required to provide contact information. All he needed to do was reach out to the airline and explain the situation. He reached for his phone, but hesitated again. What if this wasn't a coincidence? The timing was too perfect, the similarity in luggage too precise. Could this be the work of corporate spies, a carefully orchestrated theft disguised as a simple mix-up? Paranoia was an occupational hazard in his position, but it had kept him one step ahead of his competitors for years. Before involving others, Alexander decided to investigate the contents of the suitcase himself. If this was espionage, there might be clues within. He needed tools to bypass the lock without damaging potential evidence. From his desk drawer, he retrieved a small kit of specialized tools, a hobby he had developed in his youth and refined over years of technical tinkering. Few people knew that before he became a tech mogul, Alexander had been something of a lock enthusiast, fascinated by the mechanics of security systems. Within minutes, he had bypassed the combination lock using a technique that would have impressed professional locksmiths. The latch is released with a satisfying click, and Alexander carefully opened the suitcase, prepared for anything from corporate documents to sophisticated surveillance equipment. What greeted him was entirely unexpected. There were no documents, no electronic devices, nothing that suggested espionage or corporate theft. Instead, the suitcase contained neatly folded women's clothing, a small collection of well-worn paperback novels, a leather-bound journal, and what appeared to be research materials, scientific journals, and handwritten notes filled with complex equations and diagrams. Alexander stared at the contents, trying to make sense of this development. His rational mind immediately began constructing a profile of E. Blackwood, female, academic, likely in the sciences, practical rather than fashion-conscious based on the clothing choices. An avid reader, with eclectic tastes ranging from classic literature to modern mysteries judging by the book selections. The research materials suggested a specialization in a field that Alexander recognized, but couldn't immediately place something in theoretical physics or advanced mathematics. His curiosity piqued. He lifted the journal, hesitating briefly before opening it. Privacy was a concept he respected in principle, though his business practices sometimes necessitated a more flexible approach to such ethical considerations. This situation, he reasoned, warranted investigation. The journal's first page bore a name written in elegant, flowing script, Dr. Elena Blackwood. Below it, a quote from Marie Curie, "Nothing in life is to be feared, it is only to be understood." The subsequent pages revealed a mind of extraordinary depth and perception. Dr. Blackwood's notes were a fascinating blend of scientific precision and poetic observation, detailed formulas followed by philosophical musings on the nature of time and reality. Alexander found himself drawn into her thoughts, forgetting momentarily about his missing prototype plans as he turned page after page. Elena Blackwood was working on something revolutionary, a theoretical framework for understanding quantum entanglement that could potentially transform our understanding of physics, and by extension, the very nature of reality itself. Her approach was unconventional, challenging established paradigms with elegantly constructed mathematical proofs that even Alexander, with his background in advanced computing, found impressive. Interspersed among the scientific notes were more personal entries, reflections on her solitary life dedicated to research, observations of small moments of beauty in the world around her, thoughts on the isolation that often accompanied intellectual pursuit. There was a vulnerability in these words that resonated with Alexander in unexpected ways. One entry in particular caught his attention: Tokyo Conference, Day 3, presented my paper to a largely skeptical audience. The established minds in the field remain resistant to paradigm shifts, particularly from a woman who lacks the appropriate institutional affiliations. Their loss. The work speaks for itself, even if they refuse to listen. Alexander felt an unexpected surge of indignation on her behalf. He knew all too well the resistance of established powers to revolutionary ideas, had faced similar skepticism himself when he'd first proposed the neural network architecture that had become the foundation of his company's success. The difference was that he had possessed the resources and connections to force the world to take notice. Dr. Blackwood, it seemed, was fighting her battles alone. As he delved deeper into the journal, he found himself drawn into Elena's world, her struggles and triumphs, her scientific insights and personal reflections. Hours passed unnoticed as he read, completely absorbed in the mind of this stranger. It was only when the first rays of dawn began to filter through his floor-to-ceiling windows that Alexander realized he had spent the entire night immersed in Elena Blackwood's thoughts. With reluctance, he closed the journal and carefully returned it to the suitcase. The prototype plans, worth billions and the ostensible focus of his concern, had receded to a secondary consideration. Instead, he found himself contemplating how to meet the brilliant mind behind these words. Alexander Pierce, who had built his life around cold logic and strategic calculation, felt something unfamiliar stirring within him, a connection to a stranger he had never met, forged through the intimate window of her private thoughts. It was irrational, unplanned, and entirely compelling. For the first time in years, he found himself acting without a carefully calculated strategy. He reached for his phone and dialed the airline's customer service line, determined to find Dr. Elena Blackwood. The airline representative was initially resistant to providing passenger information, citing privacy policies that Alexander found simultaneously admirable and inconvenient. However, the combination of his influential name and a generous donation to the airline's charitable foundation helped overcome these bureaucratic obstacles. Within 30 minutes, he had Elena Blackwood's contact information, a hotel address in Manhattan, where she was staying for a conference following her Tokyo presentation. Alexander considered his next move carefully. The logical approach would be to call the hotel, leave a message about the switched luggage, and arrange an exchange through intermediaries. It would be efficient, professional, and maintain appropriate boundaries. Instead, he found himself instructing his driver to bring the car around immediately. The decision to deliver the suitcase personally was impulsive, uncharacteristic, and impossible to justify in purely rational terms, precisely the kind of action Alexander typically avoided. Yet as the Tesla navigated the early morning Manhattan traffic toward the Meridian Grand Hotel, he felt an unfamiliar sense of anticipation. The hotel was a historic establishment in Midtown, elegant but not ostentatious, favored by academics and visiting dignitaries rather than celebrities or tourists. Alexander entered the marble-floored lobby with the suitcase in hand, drawing curious glances from the staff, who clearly recognized him, but maintained professional discretion. At the reception desk, he cleared his throat. "I need to reach Dr. Elena Blackwood. She's a guest here." The concierge, a silver-haired man with impeccable posture, regarded Alexander with polite interest. "I'm afraid we cannot provide guest information, sir. I would be happy to pass along a message." Alexander nodded, having expected this response. "Please inform Dr. Blackwood that Alexander Pierce has her luggage and would like to meet to exchange it. I believe she has mine." He added with calculated humility, "It was my mistake at the airport." The concierge's professional demeanor softened slightly at this admission. "I'll see that she receives your message immediately, Mr. Pierce." Alexander took a seat in the lobby, declining the offer of coffee or breakfast. His mind was racing with questions about the woman whose thoughts had captivated him through the night. Would she be angry about the invasion of privacy? Would she recognize his name? Would the real-life Elena Blackwood match the brilliant, thoughtful person revealed in her journal? 23 minutes later, Alexander kept precise track. The elevator doors opened, and a woman stepped into the lobby. She was not what he had expected. Based on the profound scientific insights in her journal, he had imagined someone older, perhaps stern and academically austere. Instead, Elena Blackwood appeared to be in her early 30s, with dark curly hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and intelligent eyes that surveyed the lobby with quick precision. She wore no makeup, and her clothing was practical rather than fashionable: dark jeans, a simple blouse, and a blazer that had seen better days. Yet there was an unmistakable grace in her movements, and a confidence in her bearing that commanded attention. When her eyes found him, recognition flashed across her face, not of Alexander Pierce the billionaire, but of the man holding her suitcase. Alexander rose to his feet, suddenly aware of his rumpled suit after the long flight and sleepless night. As Elena approached, he noticed subtle details that her journal had not revealed: a small scar near her right eyebrow, the way she tilted her head slightly when focusing on something, the determined set of her mouth. "Mr. Pierce." Her voice was lower than he had imagined, with a slight huskiness that suggested either recent sleep or its absence. "You have my suitcase." It wasn't a question. "Dr. Blackwood," Alexander replied, extending his hand. "Yes, I'm afraid I mistook it for mine last night. They are nearly identical." She shook his hand briefly, her grip firm and no nonsense. "Yours has sophisticated biometric locks and probably contains something worth more than my entire career's research funding. Mine has a combination lock I've had since graduate school and contains nothing of value except to me." There was a dry humor in her tone that her journal had hinted at but not fully captured. Alexander felt an unexpected smile tug at his lips. "I wouldn't say that. Your work on quantum entanglement is quite remarkable." The words left his mouth before he could consider their implication. Elena's expression shifted immediately, warm humor replaced by cold suspicion. "You opened my suitcase." Again, not a question. "And read my journal." Alexander had faced hostile corporate takeovers and federal investigations with less trepidation than he felt meeting Elena Blackwood's steady gaze. "Yes," he admitted, seeing no point in denial. "I apologize for the invasion of privacy. I was concerned that the switch might not have been accidental. My suitcase contained sensitive material." Elena's expression remained unreadable. "So naturally, you broke into mine and read my private thoughts rather than contacting the airline or the police." Her voice was calm but edged with steel. "That seems like the action of someone with questionable ethics, Mr. Pierce, regardless of how wealthy or powerful you might be." Alexander wasn't accustomed to being called out so directly. Most people in his orbit, employees, business partners, even romantic interests, tended to defer to him. Whether out of respect for his accomplishments or desire for his favor. Elena Blackwood, it seemed, was unimpressed by either his wealth or his reputation. "You're right," he acknowledged, the admission unfamiliar on his tongue. "I should have respected your privacy. There's no justification for reading your journal, only an explanation that in the moment seemed rational, but in retrospect was clearly inappropriate." "I apologize." Elena studied him for a long moment, as if assessing the sincerity of his words. Whatever she saw in his expression must have satisfied her at least partially, because some of the tension left her shoulders. "I assume you have my suitcase here." She gestured to the Rimowa case at his feet. "Yes," Alexander confirmed, lifting it and offering it to her. "And I believe you have mine." "It's in my room," Elena replied. "I didn't open it. When I realized the mistake, I contacted the airline this morning and was planning to arrange an exchange when I received the message that you were here." The implicit contrast between their actions hung in the air between them. "I appreciate your discretion," Alexander said, meaning it. "My suitcase contains prototype plans for medical technology that could be problematic if they fell into the wrong hands." Elena raised an eyebrow. "And yet you left the airport with the wrong suitcase without checking its contents, despite these supposedly crucial plans." Her tone was more curious than accusatory now. Alexander felt a flush of embarrassment, an emotion he rarely experienced. "An oversight I'm not proud of." I was distracted by work matters. The great Alexander Pierce, tech visionary and business genius, made a human error. There was a hint of amusement in her eyes now. I'm shocked. You know who I am, Alexander observed. Elena shrugged. Your face has been on the cover of every business magazine. Your company's neural network technology is transforming multiple industries. And, she added with a small smile that transformed her face, you donated the Computational Research Center at my former university, though I doubt you remember cutting that particular ribbon among all your philanthropic endeavors. Alexander searched his memory and found the moment of facility dedication at MIT 3 years ago. Had Elena been in that crowd of academics and students? Had they crossed paths without knowing it? If we are being completely honest, Elena continued, I'm actually familiar with your work beyond what appears in popular media. Your early papers on nonlinear pattern recognition algorithms were influential in some aspects of my research. There's overlap between advanced computing and theoretical physics that many in both fields don't fully appreciate. This unexpected connection caught Alexander by surprise. Few people referenced his academic work, published before his commercial success, and fewer still understood its more theoretical implications. Would you like to get breakfast? He asked impulsively. I'd be interested to hear more about how you've applied those concepts. Elena hesitated, studying him with that same analytical gaze that seemed to peel away surface pretenses. Is this a business meeting, Mr. Pierce? Are you interested in acquiring my research? The question was direct, without artifice or social maneuvering. No, Alexander replied with equal directness. This is simply an opportunity to discuss shared intellectual interests with someone who has an interesting perspective. And perhaps a chance to make amends for invading your privacy. Elena's lips quirked in a small smile. Honesty suits you, Mr. Pierce. It seems rarer than your billions. She glanced at her watch. I have a presentation at the conference at 11, but I can spare an hour for breakfast. Let me get your suitcase. As she disappeared back into the elevator, Alexander found himself in the unfamiliar position of feeling nervous. Business negotiations with billions at stake didn't unsettle him, yet the prospect of breakfast with Elena Blackwood somehow did. When she returned with his suitcase, they walked to a small cafe adjacent to the hotel, far from the upscale establishments where Alexander typically conducted business meals. The cafe was busy with morning commuters, but they found a small table in the corner that offered some privacy. Elena ordered plain oatmeal and black coffee, with an efficiency that suggested this was her standard breakfast rather than a choice made for the occasion. Alexander, who usually left such details to assistants who knew his preferences, found himself ordering the same. So, Elena began once their coffee had arrived, you read my journal. That puts you at a distinct advantage in this conversation. You know my thoughts, my work, perhaps even my fears and hopes. I know only your public persona and academic publications. Perhaps you could even the scales somewhat. The challenge was clear, but not confrontational. She was offering him the opportunity to share something genuine in exchange for the intimacy he had taken without permission. Alexander considered her request. He was unaccustomed to personal disclosures, particularly with someone he had just met. His public narrative was carefully crafted, his private thoughts closely guarded. Yet Elena's direct approach and clear intelligence created a space where pretense seemed both impossible and undesirable. What would you like to know? He asked. Something true, she replied simply. Something not in your corporate biography or magazine profiles. Alexander took a sip of his coffee, buying time to consider his response. "I built my company because I was afraid of becoming irrelevant," he said finally, the words emerging from a place of honesty he rarely accessed. "My father was a brilliant mathematician who ended his career teaching basic algebra to disinterested undergraduates. He died believing his best work was behind him, that he had failed to make a meaningful contribution to his field. I watched brilliance fade into bitterness, and I promised myself I would never suffer the same fate." Elena listened without interruption, her eyes focused on his face with an intensity that made him feel both exposed and understood. When the server delivered their oatmeal, she thanked him without shifting her attention from Alexander. "So your empire is built on fear," she observed after a moment, not unkindly. "Not fear of failure in the conventional sense, but fear of intellectual obsolescence." Alexander had never articulated this motivation so clearly even to himself, yet hearing it from her lips, he recognized its truth. "Yes," he acknowledged. "Though I'd like to think the positive impacts of my work have transcended its origins." "Fear isn't inherently negative," Elena said, stirring her oatmeal. "It's a powerful evolutionary mechanism for survival and adaptation. The question is whether it remains a driving force or becomes a cage." She looked up at him. "Has your success alleviated the fear, Mr. Pierce? Or merely transformed it?" The question penetrated layers of self-protection that Alexander had built over years. "I don't know," he admitted, the uncertainty unfamiliar and strangely liberating. "And please, call me Alexander." Elena nodded, accepting both his invitation to informality and his honest answer. "Well, Alexander, fear is central to my work as well, though in a different context. The scientific community fears paradigm shifts. They resist ideas that challenge established theories, particularly from outsiders, without the right pedigree or institutional backing. Your journal mentioned the resistance you faced in Tokyo," Alexander noted. "But your mathematics is sound, your theoretical framework elegant. Why the skepticism?" Elena laughed softly, though there was a hint of bitterness in the sound. "You've read enough of my work to know it challenges fundamental assumptions about quantum mechanics. Add to that my gender, my lack of tenure at a prestigious institution, and my tendency to speak plainly rather than couching revolutionary ideas in reassuringly familiar terminology. The establishment doesn't like boats to be rocked, especially by people they consider outsiders." Alexander found himself unexpectedly angry on her behalf. "Their loss," he said, echoing her own journal entry. "Visionaries are rarely appreciated in their time." "Are you calling me a visionary, Alexander?" There was amusement in her voice. "That's quite a compliment from someone who's built an empire on his own vision." "I recognize patterns," he replied simply. "Your approach to entanglement theory has implications far beyond theoretical physics. If you're right and your mathematics suggests you are the applications could transform computing, telecommunications, potentially even our understanding of consciousness itself." Elena's expression shifted, surprise replacing amusement. "You understood more from my notes than I would have expected from someone outside the field." "I have diverse interests," Alexander said with a small smile. "And a particular fascination with work that crosses traditional boundaries between disciplines." Their conversation flowed with remarkable ease after that, moving from theoretical physics to neural network architecture, from the philosophy of science to the ethics of technological innovation. They discovered unexpected points of connection between their seemingly disparate fields, places where Elena's theoretical framework might complement Alexander's practical applications, where his computational approaches might help resolve some of the mathematical challenges in her work. Time slipped away unnoticed until Elena glanced at her watch and exclaimed in surprise, "I need to go." My presentation is in 30 minutes, and I haven't even reviewed my slides. She gathered her things quickly, a newfound energy in her movements. This was unexpected, she said, meeting his eyes directly. But not unpleasant. Alexander felt an unfamiliar reluctance to end their conversation. Would you have dinner with me tonight? He asked. I'd like to continue our discussion. Elena paused, studying him with that now familiar analytical gaze. Is this a business proposition or a personal invitation? Both, Alexander admitted. I'm interested in your work and its potential applications. But I'm also interested in continuing our conversation on a personal level. The two aren't mutually exclusive. Elena seemed to appreciate his honesty. Dinner would be acceptable, she said with a formality that was belied by the warmth in her eyes. But I should warn you, I'm leaving New York tomorrow. My research funding barely covered attendance at this conference, and New York hotel rates are prohibitive for academics without corporate backing. I understand, Alexander said, though in truth, the constraints of limited funding were a distant memory. Shall I meet you at your hotel at 7? Elena nodded, then hesitated. One condition, she said. No excessively expensive restaurants where the portions are tiny and the waitstaff hover uncomfortably. I prefer places where the focus is on good food and good conversation rather than status and scene. Alexander smiled, charmed by her directness. I know just the place. As Elena hurried away with both her suitcase and her presentation materials, Alexander watched her go with a sense of anticipation he hadn't felt in years. The prototype plans, worth billions and the initial cause of his concern, sat beside him in their secure case, momentarily forgotten in favor of something potentially more valuable, a connection with a mind as brilliant and unconventional as his own. A person who saw through pretense and demanded authenticity. Alexander Pierce, who had built his life around strategic calculation and careful control, found himself facing an unfamiliar and compelling uncertainty. For the first time in recent memory, he had no 5-year plan, no carefully mapped strategy for what might come next. There was only dinner that evening, and the intriguing Dr. Elena Blackwood. Alexander returned to his penthouse with an unfamiliar energy coursing through him. The meeting with Elena had awakened something dormant, a reminder of the pure intellectual excitement that had characterized his early career before the demands of running a global corporation had consumed his focus. His assistant had filled his calendar with urgent meetings, all of which now seemed less important than they had the day before. With uncharacteristic decisiveness, he instructed his assistant to reschedule everything except the board meeting scheduled for the following morning. For the first time in years, Alexander Pierce was clearing his schedule for something unrelated to business obligations. The afternoon passed in a blow of productivity unlike anything he had experienced recently. The prototype plans, now safely recovered, were reviewed and prepared for the board presentation. But alongside this necessary work, Alexander found himself diving into research related to Elena's theories on quantum entanglement. He accessed scientific databases that he maintained subscriptions to but rarely used personally, downloading and absorbing her published papers with the focused intensity that had characterized his early career as a researcher. Her work was even more impressive in its formal presentation than the journal notes had suggested, mathematically rigorous, yet boldly innovative, challenging established paradigms with elegantly constructed proofs and thoughtfully designed experimental proposals. What struck Alexander most was how Elena's theories, if proven correct, could potentially transform the neural network architecture that formed the foundation of his company's technology. The implications were staggering: computing speeds increased exponentially, energy requirements reduced to a fraction of current levels, entirely new applications made possible by the fundamental reconceptualization of information processing. By late afternoon, Alexander found himself sketching out preliminary designs for a collaborative research initiative that could bring together his company's resources and Elena's theoretical framework. It would require significant investment, but could potentially yield revolutionary results. The business case was compelling, but Alexander acknowledged to himself that his interest went beyond potential profit margins or technological advancement. There was something about Elena herself, her brilliant mind, her forthright manner, her uncompromising integrity, that had captured his attention in a way no potential business partner ever had. At precisely 6:30, Alexander left his penthouse for the Meridian Grand Hotel. He had chosen a restaurant for their dinner carefully, not one of the exclusive establishments where he was typically photographed with business associates, but a small Italian place in the village owned by a family who had steadfastly refused multiple offers to franchise or expand. The food was exceptional, the atmosphere intimate without being romantic, and most importantly, it was a place where conversation could flow without interruption or pretense. When he arrived at the hotel, Elena was waiting in the lobby, punctual to the minute. She had changed from her morning attire into a simple dark blue dress that Alexander suspected might be her only formal outfit for the conference. Her hair was still pulled back, though a few curls had escaped to frame her face. She wore no jewelry except small silver earrings and carried the same well-worn leather bag he had noticed earlier. "How was your presentation?" he asked as they walked to his car. "Contentious," Elena replied with a small smile that suggested she hadn't entirely minded the controversy. "Professor Harrington from Cambridge challenged my baseline assumptions about quantum field behavior in non-Euclidean spacetime. When I demonstrated the mathematical proof that invalidated his objection, he suggested that the practical applications were too remote to justify further research funding. The classic retreat position when theoretical challenge fails," Alexander observed. "Attack the practical relevance rather than admit the theoretical merit." Elena's smile widened. "Exactly. Though in this case, I had an unexpected response ready." She glanced at him with a hint of mischief. "I mentioned that certain industry leaders in advanced computing see potential commercial applications for my framework, and that preliminary discussions about research partnerships were underway." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "A strategic exaggeration." "Let's call it an anticipatory truth," Elena replied. "This morning, I had no such discussions. Tonight, I'm having dinner with a tech industry leader who spent the morning reading my research. Whether anything develops remains to be seen, but the statement itself was technically accurate as of the moment I made it." Her clever wordplay and strategic thinking impressed Alexander. Elena Blackwood was not just a brilliant theoretician, but a savvy operator who understood how to navigate the politics of her field despite her outsider status. The restaurant welcomed them warmly, the owner greeting Alexander by name and leading them to a quiet corner table partially secluded by a brick archway. The space was cozy rather than opulent, with simple decor and soft lighting that created an atmosphere of intimate comfort. "You come here often?" Elena asked as they settled into their seats. "Often enough to know the food is exceptional, rarely enough that it feels special each time," Alexander replied. "It reminds me of a place near MIT, where I used to go as a graduate student before wealth complicated my relationship with simple pleasures." Elena studied him over the menu. "Does it complicate simple pleasures?" "Inevitably," Alexander admitted. "When you can have anything, the value of everything shifts. Scarcity creates appreciation in ways abundance cannot." A surprisingly philosophical observation from someone who has built an empire on creating abundance through technology, Elena noted. Their conversation flowed effortlessly through dinner, moving from professional to personal, and back again, with an ease that Alexander found both unfamiliar and exhilarating. Elena spoke of her childhood in a small town in Michigan, where her fascination with the stars had led her first to astronomy and then to the physics that explained cosmic mysteries. Alexander shared stories of his early days coding in a dormitory room, the excitement of creating something from nothing, the pure joy of solving problems that others thought unsolvable. They discovered shared experiences as academic outsiders, Elena because of gender and background, Alexander because of his unconventional approaches, an eventual decision to pursue commercial applications rather than pure research. As the evening progressed, Alexander found himself sharing thoughts and memories he had not voiced in years, perhaps ever. There was something about Elena that invited honesty, that made pretense seem not just unnecessary but impossible. When the restaurant began to empty around them, Alexander realized they had been talking for nearly 4 hours. "I've kept you too late," he said, noting the time with surprise. "You mentioned you're leaving tomorrow." "My flight is at 2, Elena confirmed. "Back to my teaching position and the small lab where I conduct my research on evenings and weekends, when institutional resources aren't being used by better-funded projects." There was no self-pity in her tone, merely a statement of fact. "It doesn't have to be that way," Alexander said carefully. "My company has research facilities that sit empty half the time, computing resources that would make your university's setup look like a calculator, and funding that could support your work without the political constraints of academic grants." Elena's expression grew cautious. "Are you offering me a job, Alexander?" "I'm suggesting a collaboration," he clarified. "Your theoretical framework combined with my company's resources and practical applications. We could revolutionize both fields simultaneously." Elena took a sip of her wine, considering his words. "And what would the terms of this collaboration be? Who would own the intellectual property? Who would control the research direction? Who would decide which applications to pursue first?" These were sophisticated questions that revealed Elena's understanding of how scientific partnerships typically advantage the partner with greater resources. Alexander appreciated her direct